Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits using technology. Joining me today is Amelia Kohm to talk about data visualization. Amelia, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you, Alex.
So for people hearing you for the very first time, can you tell me your superhero origin story? That is to say, how did you get started working with nonprofits?
Okay, I guess I have to take on this mantle of superhero. So I do data visualization, as you just mentioned, but for most of my career, I worked at a child policy research center at the University of Chicago called Chapin Hall. And sort of my origin story is that, for years I worked on different studies. Chapin Hall does applied research. So I was always working with government or private nonprofits that dealt with something around children and families. We either collected original data from them or we worked with data they already had to understand some issue related to children and families. And what I came to understand, because I kind of had the same experience over and over again, is that the people of these organizations talked a good game about data because we all have to, in order to get funding and sort of survive in the world. But when you really got down to it with them, they often didn't have very good data analysis skills, but for good reason. I mean, they didn't get into the game they were playing to do data analysis. They got into it to help children and families. But the reality of all of our lives now is that we have to deal with data all the time, whether we like it or not. So I became more and more interested in how to make data easier for those without high-level analytical skills to extract meaning from data. And that, of course, led me to data visualization. And I'll talk more about that in relationship to, I'm sure, other questions you're going to ask me about Data Viz. But that's how I was drawn to Data Viz.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of questions coming up. So can you maybe define, so we'll use the word data viz just to keep things shorter. Can you describe exactly or define what it is? What is data viz?
So it's just simply charts, maps, and graphs. It's taking data that's in the form of words and numbers and translating it into a different format using color, shape, size, placement.
And there must be obviously, or there is obviously a element to it that there are many ways of visualizing this kind of data. There must be certain choices you make along the way based on the data you're looking at and who the audience is to figure out what is the best way of representing that kind of data. So could you give us maybe a couple of examples of categories of different kinds of data viz that you would take on? And how do you make that determination of saying this is probably the best template for this kind of data and this kind of audience?
Right. Yeah. So the main thing I do is I design interactive dashboards, but I also do static visualizations that help organizations mainly to show their need and to track their progress. So showing need is often in the service of fundraising. This can be about visualizing information about the needs of current or potential clients. So it may draw on organizations' own data or other data such as census data to show who is affected, how they are affected, where they are, etc. And then the other main thing I show in visualizations is the progress of organization over time and towards their goals. And that's often about using data that they collect from and about their clientele to understand trends and, of course, progress towards goals. Often organizations plan programs with things like logic models, which are just it's just a fancy name for a flow chart showing, sort of their inputs and their immediate outputs and their long-term outcomes. And I sometimes help organizations to visualize that, to understand their progress on, how well did they implement the activities and did they lead to that sort of outputs and outcomes that they expected. And you're absolutely right. Choosing the right charts, graphs, and maps depends a lot on sort of what the task is. What are the actions that the organization wants to take that are to be informed by data? But also understanding them and their sort of facility with data and all the audiences who might be consuming these visualizations. I take all that in deciding, what types of charts, maps, and graphs to use in particular situations.
You mentioned the word interactive dashboards, and for my mind, at least up until now, I was always imagining just static types of dashboards. So, can you give me an example, or give us an example of what a interactive dashboard can look like?
Yeah, so I use a very common product for creating data visualizations called Tableau, but there's lots of products out there, and a lot of them allow for interactive data visualization. So you can build what's called an interactive dashboard, and what that means is that you have a chart that's showing a particular measure, but you can add filters to it so that you can see, for example, if you're looking at a trend line of like how many clients you've served over time, you can have an overall amount, but then use a filter to show, well, how many of those clienteles are from different zip code areas, or how many are of different gender types or different racial categories, or have been in the program for certain lengths of time. So it really allows you to look at your data from a number of different angles and is a very powerful tool.
If I were to give you an example where, let's say, you're looking at consensus data across the US, and you would show maybe as a starting point the map of the US, all the various states, maybe color coded or some kind of graphical element, you're saying that you'd be able to potentially click on any one of those states and kind of zooms in, filters on just that particular state, and then maybe drill down a bit further to get more specific on what kind of data you're showing?
Yeah, absolutely. That is something you could do with the interactive dashboard. Yeah, that's a term we use, is drilling down. So you have a sort of aggregated data, and then you sort of disaggregate it into smaller groups to look at it from a number of different angles.
And I imagine that you said Tableau is what you're using. From the client side, the audience that is looking at this data and drilling down, I mean, is it as simple as just going to a particular website and being able to do that? Or do you have to offer some kind of, like, do they need to have some kind of special software on their side to be able to interact with this data?
Tableau has this great product called Tableau Public, which is actually completely free. And I often use it with my clients. It has much of the same capabilities as the paid version. The only difference is that you have to save it to the Tableau server. And there's also the other difference is there's fewer possible data connections, but you can still connect to things like Excel spreadsheets and Google Sheets. But it also allows you to embed a visualization, including interactive visualizations, into websites. So yeah, so if if this is going to be a visualization that you want to make completely open to the world, then you can create it in Tableau Public and then get a embed code for it and publish it on your website, and the whole world can interact with it.
That's actually really cool because it gives you the clients better interactivity, better understanding of how the organization works. I can see a lot of power there.
Yeah, it's really a great product. So often, unless the data we're working with is sensitive, then you're going to want to use the paid version of Tableau because you're going to want it to be password protected. But if you're okay with publishing it on the Tableau server, which a lot of my clients are because they're going to share it with the world anyway, and you can strip data of identifiers like people's names and social security numbers and telephone numbers and stuff, where you only just have a unique ID for each person, for example, in your data set. And I can use Tableau Public to create a really sophisticated data dashboard for organization. And then when they're done working with me, then they have this dashboard they can use into the future, and there's no ongoing cost. But if their data is sensitive, there's also discounts that Tableau offers for nonprofits too. So there's lots of different ways to use Tableau if you're a nonprofit.
The whole concept of taking very concrete, very low level, very detailed data and then generating either an interactive or even a static dashboard of it that is easy to consume is really fascinating to me. I was hoping you could explain some of the reasons why this kind of medium is so powerful. Like, why is Data Viz so important to get right? And when it's done right, the impact that it can have.
Right. So as I mentioned before, even small organizations are dealing with data all the time. It's like drinking from a fire hose. And many nonprofits spend a lot of resources, including money, time, and bandwidth on, on their computers, collecting, inputting, and storing data in spreadsheets and in databases. But then they often end up using only a small fraction of that data to inform their decisions and improve their work. They may use statistics here and there in a funding proposal or in annual reports, but they often aren't using it on a daily basis because they don't know how. And of course, they're incredibly busy with other things. So, I think of data just as a tool that we use to do our jobs. And we don't invest in other tools, for example, computers, and just, get them and then store them away in a storage room and never use them. But that's often what we do with data. Good data visualization, often in the form of a data dashboard, as I just discussed, can help nonprofits to see how they're doing over time in relationship to their goals, what's working, what's not, how certain subgroups are doing compared to others among their clientele. So it's really a great way to make all that data that you're collecting and you storing anyway and put it to good use to improve your work.
There was a quote that I read recently from a book I'm reading, and I forget the title offhand. I didn't actually write the title in my notes, but the quote said, our brains don't do statistics well. Math is not our natural language, and even extremely visual plots and numerical graphs demand super concentration. I'm curious to know what your take is on that sentence.
Yeah, I agree with it. When I'm doing workshops on Data Viz, because that's another thing I do webinars a bunch of times each year on different Data Viz topics, I often show two images side by side. So on the left is the image of the Mona Lisa, and on the right is the image of just a spreadsheet with typical data that a nonprofit might have. And I ask the group, which image do they comprehend first? And then I quickly say, please don't answer the question. I already know your answer, which is because we're all humans, we all understand the Mona Lisa much more quickly. And that's because our visual systems have evolved over millions of years to process images essentially in parallel. And what do I mean by that, essentially in parallel? Well, we don't read the Mona Lisa from top to bottom and from left to right. What we do is we take it all in together and understand almost instantly that this is a picture of a woman in front of a landscape in a dark dress. Words and numbers only appeared within the last few thousand years and have been consumed by humans for less than 1,000 years. By contrast, we and our ancestors have been processing visual information for millions of years. So our brains have evolved to be specially geared for visual signals. And indeed, we use about half of our brain's volume for visual analysis. And that's because for most of human history, our survival depended on it. We had to detect danger at a distance, think about predators, lying in the tall grass. We needed our visual systems to be really, really keen in order to survive. So we appear to be just at the beginning of our journey with data, human beings. Processing words and numbers is really a quite recent activity for us. Perhaps as our brains evolve, we'll be able to discern a whole spreadsheet at a glance sometime in the future. But until then, we should consider visualizing our data by translating words and numbers into visual formats, like I mentioned before, color, shape, size, placement. But I really agree with your quote, Alex, that even extremely visual plots and numerical graphs demand super concentration. And it's hard to get others or even ourselves to concentrate that hard. If we want others to learn from data, which involves not only retaining it, but also drawing knowledge from it and applying that knowledge to our work, then we need to design visualizations very carefully. And that often involves further understanding of how the brain works. So you may have heard of Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. According to the evidence that Kahneman presents in that great book, for learning to happen, information first must pass what he calls system one of our brains. And this is where fast thinking happens. So system one, you can kind of think of as like sort of that harried gatekeeper, madly processing all the informations that's coming in through our senses all the time. And what it's doing is pitching most of it and just keeping only what it deems as necessary. But getting through the gate is really only half the battle. Once information does get past that system one, it confronts what he calls system two. And this is the part of the brain that allows for conscious thought, or what he calls slow thinking. The problem is that system two is lazy. So conscious thought is hard, and system two is always looking for an excuse to avoid it. But if system two engages with information, the resulting knowledge can find its way to long-term memory, and that's when learning happens. So the challenge when presenting data is to get past both system one and then engage system two. And so I've thought about that. So to get past the sort of fast-thinking, harried system one, we need to grab attention of our viewers. And we can do that by using sort of interesting-looking charts, engaging color schemes, and even incorporating images into charts, graphs, and map. Images of human faces work particularly well. We're sort of wired to pay attention to faces, or novel images, images that are unusual in size and placement. So that's all about getting attention. And then to engage that sort of lazy, slow thinking system too, we need to remember that we really need to think about piquing our audience's interests. So we can do that by engaging in interesting chart titles. There's actually research out there that shows that people first pay attention to the title of a chart. So I often like to pose a question rather than saying, making a chart sort of like the number of women over time engaged in part-time work. It's not an engaging title, but instead of using a title like, I'm just thinking totally off the top of my head, why are there so few women engaged in part-time work, or something like that, using a question that the chart then is able to answer. So that's another way to sort of pique the interest of system two. We can also use captions to highlight a surprising data point. Another thing we can do is, just try to slow down our viewers. And one way to do that may be to use hand-drawn charts rather than programs like Tableau. There actually is some evidence that making information harder to consume, for example, by presenting it with harder to read fonts, make the brain slow down and engage in effortful and analytical processing. But the jury's still out on this. But I do find myself more likely to engage in hand-drawn visualizations. Perhaps it's not because it's harder to read, but simply because it's more of a novelty. So anyway, I think really carefully when creating charts, graphs, and maps about just what you're sort of posing with that quote, that, that our brains kind of rebel at processing information even when present visually. So we really have to do it quite carefully. That's a long answer, Alex. I'm sorry, but I had a lot to say now.
I love it. No, and this would be the moment in the podcast where if we were face to face, you would see me rolling up my sleeves, because I love this topic. The whole element of the visualization of it. The book, Thinking Fast, Slow, is a great book. I highly recommend it to all my listeners. And it corresponds to a passion of mine, which is user experience, UX, principles and design. So one of the courses I took back in the day was about human-computer interaction and how we as humans process information at a very basic level. Like you mentioned, system one, system two is what the author applied it or labeled it as. Mm-hmm. I was initially taught it's more of a top-down and bottom-up type of processing.
Okay.
That the top-down is very slow. It takes time, and the bottom-up is very fast. It's pre-attentive, it's called. It can take less than 250 milliseconds, and it's really good for simple, unique traits that stand out. So we're talking about visual traits like color, length, width, 3D cues. These we process extremely fast because it's, to your point, innate. We've been doing it for so long because our survival for a long time depended on it. And you can use that knowledge to help build better, in this case, charts and graphs to get that attention, and then pulling them in for that system two to spend more time than analyzing it. So this is like, I can get really excited about this. So I have to pace myself and slow down, but I love it. And the attention or the explicit desire to actually slow a person down is the first time I've heard of it, but it makes total sense for me as well. And that these are important, presumably. The reason you're doing all of this data viz is because there's an important message to share, whether it's for the nonprofit itself or for the nonprofit's clients. And you do want the attention of your audience. This is not something that they should just glance at and then discard. This is something that they need to consume. So slowing them down a little bit, engaging that system too, is a really, you're right. It's very important. And I love how the concept of even doing it hand drawn can slow it down, or changing the font. That's a really, I'm learning a lot. Basically, is what I'm saying.
I haven't actually tested out the, harder to read font thing, but I do think about the just generally slowing down, maybe by not making it so hard to read, but at least, sort of engaging them in a question that's of particular interest to them. Another thing you can do is this idea of putting the viewer in the viz. So it seems that the kind of data we're all most interested in is data about ourselves. So if you can find a way to put the viewer in the viz, that can work really well. I've seen The Guardian, the newspaper, did this in a brilliant piece that I saw where they were, now I can't remember, they were presenting a bunch of statistics. And instead of just presenting them, they had an interactive feature where you could guess what the answer was. And then, to whatever, what's the percentage of people living below the poverty line, or, that sort of thing. And then you guess the answer. And then they present to you a very simple chart that shows what your answer was in relationship to what the data actually show, and in relationship to what other people guessed. So it made it really interesting and engaging, because you can see, sort of how far off the mark you were. Were you closer to the mark than most other people were? And it kind of drew you into the subject matter much more so than just giving you a bunch of numbers.
Going back to the Mona Lisa reference, as you mentioned it, I was thinking not only is it obviously more pleasurable to look at it than a graph and chart, but it's also eliciting an emotional response. And I'm curious to know, is there any value, or is there do you seek out to create some kind of emotional response with your charts?
Yeah. So, I didn't mention this idea of using faces. I've dabbled with that because I do think that we have a visceral reaction to faces. And, the whole point of data visualization is to, create this abstract understanding. So, the idea of replacing people with dots on a chart, for example, that's abstracting humans and taking out, just focusing on one aspect of them, like their amount of participation in a program, for example. But in doing that, although it may make patterns more perceptible, changes over time, that sort of thing, what it also does is sort of strip them of their humanity, right? You forget that you're talking about actual people. So I've experimented with, trying to put the faces of the people. Obviously, usually data is, the people behind the data, it's a confidential situation, but you can use, maybe stock images that represent the types of people who are behind the data, to sort of, even on kind of like unconscious level, remind your viewers, we're talking about actual people here. Another way of doing it is by actually including data about real individuals in the visualization. So if you have sort of a dot matrix chart where each circle does represent an individual, you can, with these interactive visualizations, you can do it so that when you hover or scroll over one of those marks, you can learn some pertinent facts about each one of those individuals. So you can, when you're not scrolling over it, you can kind of see the overall pattern. You can see, that 5 out of 100 people had a certain trait or whatever. But then you can scroll over the circles or squares or even icons that look like people to learn more about sort of the individuals behind the data.
Going back to the primal side of things, yeah, I heard that we see faces even when there aren't any because it's just we're built to recognize faces. So sometimes there are pictures that you see in the news about seeing a face in the smoke or seeing a face in the rocks. You know, we're programmed to look and recognize for faces that we'll see them even when they're not really there, or they're there for like a moment of a second and it kind of looks like a face a little bit. I find that's absolutely fascinating as well.
Yeah, I mean, the classic example is the moon, right? We see a face on the moon and they're just craters. Yeah.
Absolutely. So when you're starting an engagement working with a nonprofit, obviously you have to work with the data that they have. And I'm curious to know, how do you figure out, how do you decide what is the most useful information to separate that signal from the noise?
Right. So, yeah, it's all about finding patterns, and we can easily detect patterns or more easily detect patterns when we're using visual formats. So, in my workshops, I do another little exercise where I show the group a simple spreadsheet that has two rows. So, sort of imagine this. One of the rows is for foundation grants, and one of the rows is for corporate grants. And then there are exactly 12 columns, one for each month of the year. So it's a really, really simple table. And in each cell is a dollar amount. And then I just give them a few seconds, not even a whole minute, to use this information to answer three questions. And the three questions are, were foundation or corporate grants consistently higher over time? And how did foundation grants trend upward, downward, or some other pattern? And same for corporate grants. What were their trends? Again, just a few seconds, because then I show them the exact same data, but in a simple line chart format. The line chart has two lines, one for foundation grants, one for corporate grants. And again, I give them just only a few seconds to answer those three questions, but now it's so much easier to see the patterns because the charts make them really, really perceptible. You can see either an upward or downward trend in just milliseconds. And you can even see more complex trends, such as a cyclical trend across each quarter of the year. Whereas detecting that kind of pattern would be really, really hard looking at a spreadsheet and take a lot longer. So I try to design visualizations to make what patterns are there much more perceptible, and that works out differently depending on the data and sort of the purpose of the chart.
I noticed for a lot of the charts that you shared with me that as you're doing the data points, the last dot seems to be a different color than the rest of the chart. I'm curious to know why that is.
Yeah, well, I have a lot of opinions on colors in charts. So charts work best when you use color both wisely and judiciously. I mean, color is one of those pre-attentive visual signals, right? That we perceive pre-attentively. So we perceive it really, really fast. So it's a powerful cue, and we need to use it carefully. So, so there's just like some basic rules, like you shouldn't use the same color hue for two different variables in the same chart or in side-by-side chart. Similarly, you shouldn't use the same color saturation for different magnitudes of the same variable in side-by-side charts. You should also not use too many different color encodings on one chart or one dashboard. I think a bright, fully saturated color, it's kind of like yelling. You don't want to yell all the time. People think you're crazy and they'll stop listening to you. So it's important to moderate your color as you might moderate your voice, and only yell when you have a really important point to make. And then provide all the other information in softer, less saturated colors to provide contrast. So to make charts easier to read, I work to limit the number of colors in general, and I use those bright, fully saturated colors very carefully.
In my UX studies, a similar vein where we were looking at and analyzing websites or web applications, and there was two examples. One which was basically black and white, and the other one which was full color but like oversaturated in color.
Yeah.
And the idea was that both of those ideas is bad. The first one there's nothing to look at, nothing that draws your attention. It's all just words on a page, even though it was kind of separated and kind of scattered, menus and so forth. And the second one was just oversaturated, which means you don't know where your eyes to look, which means you don't know where to look in terms of your eyes. And it's caused a lot of stress. And I understood
Right.
that from that exercise is that you actually do want to cause a certain amount of stress on your eyes to engage the audience without going too far in either direction. So I guess the same principles apply for these data viz.
Yeah, that's interesting. I never thought about that. You want to apply some stress, but you want to do it really carefully, right? Like you want to be in control of where that stress is.
Right. Because yeah, too
Yeah.
little and you just get bored. You look at it, you're not quite sure where to look. It's like walking
Yeah.
into a white room with white furniture and white everything. It's just there's nothing that draws your attention. Versus usually there's a focal point in a room that
Yeah.
captures your attention, and then you work your way outwards from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I really try to apply sort of the conventional wisdom that graphic designers understand in designing data visualizations. And of course, providing a focal point is a really important one. So you have to, in designing any chart, graph, or map, I make a decision about what their focal point should be. And then I use things like color and contrast and white space to direct my viewers' attention to the focal point.
I imagine at this point in your career, you've done data viz so often that you have this library of templates. And I'm curious to know, is it when you're given a certain scenario, you know exactly already what template you're going to use? Or is that something that comes up once you've done maybe a further investigation?
Yeah, I really start from scratch with each chart. The whole idea is to custom design it to make it a useful tool for specific intended users. So I use what I know of the intended users, their interests, their facility with data, etc., and what I know about the data. Important thing to understand about the data, of course, are its limitations, because all data has certain limitations. And I also draw on what I know about the questions the users have and the actions they need to take based on the data. And I use all that to design the chart. So I don't start with a template. Of course, I'm always drawing on ideas maybe that I've used before or that others used before. I don't know if you heard that book called Steal Like an Artist. I mean, I think, there's no really such idea as an original idea. We all draw inspiration from other things. So I definitely draw inspiration, but I don't start with sort of, a template and then just modify it.
The word that I use is creative plagiarism.
Yeah, there you go. I like that.
And we're also curious, taking a step back, we talked about the data that comes from nonprofits. Is there ever a situation where either the nonprofit doesn't have enough data or the data is just so piecemeal together and hard to decipher that you don't know where to start?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a big problem is, what we call dirty data. So that's data that's been entered into a database or a spreadsheet, but not in a consistent way. So, it's just like something as simple as, you have a database of your participants and 1 month Michael Smith joins your program and you enter Michael Smith into your database, and then Michael Smith drops out of your program 2 months later and comes back a year later, and someone else is working there and enters Michael Smith in as Michael B. Smith. And maybe Michael Smith has a different address at that point. And all of a sudden, according to the data, this is two separate people, not one person. And so tracking Michael Smith's progress over time is going to be really, really hard because you have data in two different places. It's just really, really common. You can see how easily that would happen. A lot of organizations have low-level staff, or maybe even more common is to have many different staff members entering data into a database. And so it gets entered in different ways by different people. If you have, if you're a larger organization and you have clear data guidelines and you have built into your database, so it's much more difficult. You have, sort of data validation mechanisms in your database, then it often can be more consistent. But no organization is not to be set to some extent by dirty data. So to answer your question more specifically, have I ever has a client ever come to me and I just the data's in such disarray and so unreliable that I can't do anything with it? I'd say no to that question, but we sometimes through the process of creating visualizations, issues with their data come out. Because we can understand data better visually, sometimes when you visualize data, something can look not quite right, like this trend doesn't look quite right according to, our just on the ground understanding of what's going on. And then you can look into the data and figure out why this trend might be wrong, because there's some bad data behind it. So it can become sort of a tool for understanding where there's problems in the data and where they need to be cleaned up.
It sounds like it's more of a refinement process than just saying this data is crap, I can't work with it.
So far, that's the case, with my clientele. But there's probably an organization out there that has just such bad data, it's not usable, I guess.
I'm curious to know, what was at least one of your favorite projects to work on? When did you, something you've either been most proud of or you were really excited to work with? And, you don't need to mention actual names, but I'm just curious the kind of output that you generated from that project.
Okay. Well, the thing that just jumped to my mind first is one of my clients had, in the past served women dealing with domestic violence and domestic abuse. And so they primarily provide therapy to these women. And they had a system where therapists they talked about their healing journeys of each one of these women. And after each time a therapist met with a woman, they would assign them sort of where they are in terms of 5 stages in the healing journey. Are they just at the beginning and they're in a lot of danger? I can't remember what each stage was, but it was kind of like you can think of them as steps up a ladder. Each stage was getting them further to where they were in a stable, mentally healthy, safe state in their lives. And they really wanted to understand how their clients were doing. Like, what do these journeys actually look like? Because, they understood that they're probably not like this simple where you start at stage 1 and then every month you step up to a higher stage. So we used a number of visualizations to look at particular clients' journeys. And as they imagined, they were very kind of up and down situations. Sometimes they would start at a higher stage and descend to a lower stage and up and down. And they found that so interesting that they were interested in looking further at, well, what's happening at these sort of inflection points when a client moves from a lower stage to a higher stage or a higher stage to a lower stage. And so we did some really novel visualizations where we put in icons for different life events, and they were able to look at what types of life events corresponded with changes in stages. So it was just a very, very novel situation. I hadn't looked at that kind of data before, so it was really fun and creative.
Yeah, it's awesome. Has there ever been a moment where you were kind of shocked with the data? Like you would see either something very powerful or unexpected, and you kind of like took a breath to say, oh my goodness, I can't believe what I'm looking at. And then, let that kind of wash over you.
Yeah. One of my clients, they totally didn't understand this till it was visualized. Again, it was looking at their own clients' participation, and not till I visualized it were they made aware that less than half the clients made it past their first visit to the organization. There was this huge drop off, and then they were looking at what I think of as, and this works really well in a funnel chart, like how many clients start at the beginning, they come in for an intake, how many people sort of make it past the intake, that sort of thing, and then make it through various programs that they offer. And this organization just had a huge drop off after the intake. And then they had drop offs at other stages of the process as well. So I think that was really helpful to them. And they started asking, more questions about that. I think they were so focused on the clients who stayed, which makes sense, that they weren't paying so much attention to the clients they were leaving and trying to understand why those clients weren't persisting with their program.
Yeah, that must be really powerful to see, and amazing feedback for the organization as well, because obviously when they get that kind of knowledge, they can adapt and change and modify their programs. I'm curious to know, what is in your short-term future? What would you like to, or where would you like to see yourself in the next couple of years?
I really like working with individual clients, and I work with several at a time at any given time. And I kind of like, when I was a researcher at Chapin Hall, I would work on multi-year studies. So, it was all about going in deep into one subject matter. And of course, in academia, that's sort of how you do well. You go really, really deep into one often, sort of small area of knowledge and become the expert in that area. And I feel like I was never cut out for that. I did it for a long time, but I think I'm just too curious and I want to know about a lot of things. So in working with several different clients at a time, I get to work on a number of different issues. And I like that. It's sort of like serial monogamy. And so in my near future, I hope to continue to do that. And I also like doing these webinars and workshops on Data Viz. I get excited talking about data visualization. So it's fun to share my knowledge. So it's kind of keep on keeping on for my immediate future, I think.
Awesome. This has been really insightful. I know I learned a lot as well. Where can people find more about you online and perhaps get in touch with follow-up questions?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm always happy to do a free consultation. So if you just have questions about your data or not even sure you need help or not, you can go to my website, which is nonprofitviz, all one word, .com. And you can, I have like a little calendar link and you can sign up to meet with me online. You can also find samples of my work on my website and testimonials from past clients. I also list upcoming presentations. I actually have neglected to list my next presentation. So can I mention it here?
Definitely. Please go ahead.
Okay. So there's an great organization called the Nonprofit Learning Lab that does tons of online webinars for nonprofits on different topics. I've done a number of webinars for them, and I have one coming up called How to Build an Effective Data Dashboard. It's on May 9th at 10 a.m. And I think that's a free webinar. I will put it up on my website, and you can also find it on the Nonprofit Learning Lab website as well. And I also have a blog on my website called 60-Second Data Tips. So if you visit my website, you can sign up for this blog, and I will send you once a week a tip that only takes 60 seconds to read, and sort of you can kind of very quickly and painlessly up your data game by just reading my very brief blog entry every week.
Awesome. We'll be sure to share those links in the show notes below.
Great. Thank you.
Amelia, thank you so much for joining me today.
It was so fun talking to you, Alex. And it was great to talk to someone with the UX background. I'd never had someone interview me who talked about pre-attentive processing. So that was cool.
All right. That's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.